Hello and welcome to this video. And on this video, I am going to be trying to decide what is the track I would keep if I could only keep one track by the artist Frank Zappa, one of my favorite artists of all time. This hopefully will be the beginning of a series of videos, which will probably be called You Can Only Keep One Song. And then you get the idea of it. So, Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa is one of those artists that some people seem to love, some people seem to hate. He has very distinctive characteristic styles and approaches. He almost has his own universe, and he had his own processes and methods of doing things. And so when we enter into the world of Frank Zappa, we are definitely entering into his world. Within that world, there's all sorts of tracks. Some tracks represent exactly who he is, and some of them don't so much. And the big problem with Frank Zappa, we are dealing with a huge amount of material. When he died in 1993, aged 53, he had made released around about 70 albums at that point, many of these double albums. Since he's died, his family have gone into his vaults and they have literally pulled out the same number again. So we're probably talking on well over 100 albums by Frank Zappa. And so this does become a real problem with Frank Zappa, especially when you want to say to someone, oh, have you checked out Frank? No, I haven't. Well, what album should I get? I don't know which one to get. And they go, oh, I don't know. And you start stroking your chin because with an artist like Frank Zappa, it's so hard to represent him with one track. I've got a couple of tracks in mind, but before we get to that, what I want to do is I want to just go through what I think are the key characteristics of Frank Zappa and things that we would want to have on this track. And also look at some of the tracks that don't do that. So, Frank Zappa was born in 1940. He is a self-taught guitarist. He was really into rhythm and blues guitarists like Guitar Slim, Johnny Guitar Watson, growing up in the 1950s. He was also a big fan of doo-wop as well, growing up. But what made him a bit strange was, as well as liking those forms, he liked modern classical music after he discovered Varese in his early teens. By the time he got into his early 20s, in the early 1960s, he'd acquired a recording studio and he was able to really study how a recording studio works. So when rock and roll turned into rock music in the mid-60s and the record company started to sign up all sorts of weird and wonderful bands across the United States, and Frank Zappa got a deal, he was one of the few artists that walked into one of those recording studios knowing what you could do in there. And on his first album, Freak Out, he presented perhaps the most futuristic vision of what rock music could be at that time, which was 1965, 1966. And on that album, he pulled a whole bunch of elements together. There's elements of doo-wop, there's elements of pop music, but all this is done in a sort of ironic way. There's often comedic elements in, and especially on his early albums, countercultural, critical of society, sort of sneery lyrics, which sort of poke fun not only at the straight, world of these people's parents that the hippies were looking at, but he also took the mickey out of the hippies as well. There's a lot of studio experimentation. Zappa understood how the recording studio worked, and he used it like another instrument, creating all sorts of weird pops and sounds. And there's also elements of modern classical music. And Zappa was really interested in modern classical music and had taught himself to compose. His band was, to start off with, was mainly rhythm and blues musicians, but as he advanced and started to become more successful, he was able to hire musicians that could read music with a virtuosity, could play the ideas he had. And so very quickly, by the time he got to the 1970s, his music advanced to be perhaps the most complex music in the rock music canon. The only band I can think of that is anywhere near Frank Zappa for complexity is maybe Henry Cow. Bands like Gentle Giant get close now and then, and there's a few other people we could pick on. But his stuff is unbelievably complex. So by the time we get to the 1970s, Zappa has pioneered the studio as a instrument. He was a guitar hero, playing long form guitar solos before Hendrix had started to do that. He had made one of the first rock double albums. He had incorporated modern classical music into rock music. He had had jazz style improvisation, laying the groundworks for jazz fusion. Because he was bringing in modern classical music and conceptual continuity throughout the albums, he really is one of the first progressive rock artists. He was distorting the guitar, getting heavy guitar sounds. So on tracks like, There's No Way to Delay the Trouble Coming Every Day, those sorts of tracks are really heavy. So he's a pioneer of heavy metal. He's an iconic musician in himself. You could sort of draw his silhouette and do that moustache, and everyone knows who you're talking about. He's unique in the world of rock music. And because of this, or despite this, he seems to have fans like myself that absolutely worship the guy, and then a whole bunch of people are very critical of him. Now, the reason why people are critical of Frank Zappa, I think, is because of two main reasons. One is that he uses comedy, and sometimes the comedy is biting and political, but sometimes it is quite childish, it seems, and quite like toilet humor, or going into areas that civilized society would not normally go into. And I think a certain sensibility is upset by that. Also, for someone who plays rhythm and blues and soul and loves all that, he has a very strong modernist approach to music. And so there is no sentimentality in his music. He can write, in my opinion, beautiful melodies, but he's never going to write Yesterday, by the Beatles. He's never going to write one of those. There's always an angular, modernist, hard edge. There is a metaphysic there in his music, and it's quite strange, but he doesn't go off on sort of cod spirituality like the Mahavishnu Orchestra or Santana. So there's aspects of it that are very hippified and 60s psychedelic, but there's other aspects that are really against that. Anybody who adheres to any of those values in music will find Zappa difficult. By the time he gets to the 1970s, a lot of the sort of countercultural revolutionary politics that had attracted a lot of, I think, Marxists to his music, a lot of revolutionary types, had gone. And when he goes into the 1970s, he actually starts to purvey something which is radical, but he's also pointed at quite sort of conservative political values. He is a capitalist. He believes in the American way. He believes in democracy. And he champions those things, and fundamentally, underneath all this, he has a very strong sense of people having a freedom of speech, or freedom of expression. And I think for someone who is so straight down the line, so matter of fact, he also really values creativity in people. He doesn't differentiate between art and entertainment. He believed what he was doing was entertainment. And he believed that any sound, anything could be art, could be music. He believed that anyone could say or do whatever they wanted to do. When you read interviews with his children, they grow up with, sexual material in the house. They were allowed to swear, allowed to say whatever they want. And Zappa did not censor anything in the house in front of his kids. I remember reading an interview with him at one point, and someone said, "Oh, well, you wouldn't let a child just walk around swearing, would you?" And he went, "Well, yeah, why not?" And so he has a very libertarian approach to art and approach to life as well. After the early revolutionary sort of countercultural mothers of invention, which the critics loved, he then starts to move towards something which we could describe as art music, with albums like Lumpy Gravy and then Uncle Meat. And we move away from the comedy to something which is much more abstract and is like, I would say, American progressive rock. with Uncle Meat, you have a double album which experiments with all sorts of different sounds, sometimes taking clarinets and saxophones and putting so much effects on them that they start to sound in a different way, or speeding stuff up and slowing stuff down. Zappa's always experimenting sonically. As his musicians get better, he starts to bring in elements of improvisation. By the end of the 60s, he's hooked up with virtuoso jazz musicians like Jean-Luc Ponty. He's got Ian Underwood working in his band, and you start to see a very strong jazz improvisation element coming in. As an improviser, Zappa is unique on the guitar. He is what I would call a modal improviser, and he's one of the great modal improvisers. Again, his guitaring splits people down the middle. He's not interested in playing smoothly legato lines. He is interested in a sort of multitude of sound effects and junk and noise. He uses polyrhythms and quintuplets within his guitar solos, and then he spins that out into the band. And rhythmically, his use of tuplets is quite revolutionary. Certain approaches that had been used by Stravinsky, of using a thing called metric modulation, where you take one aspect of time and within that you slip in a sort of another number that fits in the same space. So, for example, you could have 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and at the same time, occupying the same space of that 4, we could have 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm doing it over 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1. So I've got 5 in the place of 4. This isn't on time signatures. This is something completely different. And Zappa takes this to the nth degree. Musicians that were highly trained in the 70s would come into his band only to be faced with rhythmical approaches that were completely alien to them. In the early 70s, he dissolves the initial Mothers of Invention, and he brings out another one with Flo and Eddie. Now, Flo and Eddie were a member of the Turtles, which are a big 60s pop band. And here he goes towards something which is very comedic. And it's an approach I don't like so much. And around about this time, he makes his film 200 Motels, first film, which is a very, very strange film. And ahead of its time, shot on video on a sound stage, in 1971, I think, when, nobody was making films on video. And around about this time, he also releases Hot Rats, which is an instrumental album, which is possibly his most accessible album to those out there who aren't a fan of his jokiness and weird modern classical stuff, with some of the tunes on that almost becoming like jazz standards. In 1970, I think 71 or 72, he was playing at the Rainbow in London, and a crazed fan jumped on stage because he believed Frank had been eyeing up his girlfriend and pushed him off the stage into the orchestral pit that was there. And it was a long drop. He hit the floor and he basically broke his pelvis and his legs. And he ended up in a wheelchair for about a year. And this was quite fortuitous in a way, because he was then forced to compose. And he starts to taking the ideas of Hot Rats, and he starts to create this music for big bands. And he releases 2 albums around this time, Waka Jawaka and The Grand Wazoo. Now, amongst my friends, especially the jazz musicians, those are the albums that they usually like. There's less vocals on there. There's some very clever improvisation. They're beautifully composed. Waka Jawaka is almost close to something like Bitches Brew or even Santana. By the time he's back able to get out on tour, the world's changed and prog and jazz fusion has entered the space, and Zappa ends up on tour with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Now, it could be argued that the Mahavishnu Orchestra's use of violin knob time signatures had been taken from Frank Zappa, who was doing that before the Mahavishnu Orchestra, but Zappa seems to be very influenced at that time, and he then creates another Mothers of Invention, which has a much stronger muscular and funky quality to it, somewhere between Stevie Wonder's band and the Mahavishnu Orchestra. And this is a band that features Ralph Humphrey and Chester Thompson on drums. You've got Ruth Underwood on percussion, usually Tom Fowler on bass, Napoleon Murphy Brock on saxophone, and the great George Duke on keyboards. And this band is a favourite of most people. Most people love what has been now called the George Duke Band, and they make another of a number of albums that are more accessible, have the comedy elements in, but seem to cross over. And this is when Zappa's really seems to be a mainstay as an artist on the scene in America. With the albums Overnight Sensation, Apostrophe, The Live, Roxy and Elsewhere, and One Size Fits All, this period really is a favourite of people. That band dissolves in the mid-70s. I think a lot of the musicians were very good, and they ended up going off into the sort of session world. And so he reconvenes another band in the late 70s, and this band travails its way through punk and disco, which Zappa seems to be inspired by, but also Monster Lampoon and Take the Mickey out of. And we get a number of very popular albums, culminating with Shake Your Booty in 1979, which is full of smut, full of comedy, but also full of some virtuoso playing. And this album is almost notorious, and it becomes Zappa's biggest selling album, selling around about 1 million copies. Throughout this time, he falls out with his record label. He sets up his own record label. He then has more freedom, and he really starts to release a lot of material at this point, bringing out, the 3-disc Shut Up and Play Your Guitar, the 3-disc Thing Fish, which is like a musical, and then every album seems to be a double album: Tinseltown Rebellion, You Are What You Is, Them or Us. He gets involved with the Synclavier, which was a very expensive keyboard and computer system in the 1980s, which is the forerunner of how we make music now, and starts to make music that was completely created within the computer. And also the 1980s, he started to put his money into getting his compositions performed with real orchestras, most notoriously getting the London Symphony Orchestra to play his compositions, which he wasn't happy with. He also collaborated with Pierre Boulez, which was more successful in terms of his view. And then at the end of his life, he did the Yellow Shark with a bunch of classical musicians that were much more sympathetic to what Zappa was doing, probably because by this point Zappa had influenced, music enough that musicians were able to take on his ideas. Throughout his life, Zappa had been a workaholic. He seems to have been a very single-minded person. He could have been very funny, and he could be very loyal, but he also seemed to be very unsentimental. He didn't seem to be a great parent, and he had 4 kids. Dweezil Zappa, who is now a musician, brilliant guitarist who carries on playing in the style of Zappa. Moon Unit, which was his first daughter, who contributed vocals to a track of his called Valley Girl, which became his only hit record in the US. And she has recently brought a book out which has really highlighted, the fact that Zappa was a serial philanderer, and he was off with groupies virtually all the time, and he never had any time really for his kids, and he was totally focused on himself. And then his wife Gail Zappa, who he'd met at the was it the Whiskey A Go Go, where she was the worked in the where you put your clothes cloakroom, seemed to also take out on her kids, especially Moon, her sort of frustration of being married to Frank Zappa. And also there's another daughter called Diva, and another son called Ahmet, who used to work with Frank Zappa, work with Dweezil Zappa in his band. His work schedule had really been very fierce. I don't think he ate properly, and he smoked like a chimney. On the video, Does Human Belong in Music, he turns around at one point, as he says that this cigarette and his coffee, they're like food to him. And that's how he gets to the day. And in his late 40s, early 50s, he got diagnosed with prostate cancer, which was missed by the doctors. And it was inoperable. And he slowly went downhill, doing a number of projects which included going out to Yugoslavia and doing concerts out there, where he had become almost a folk hero when the country was a communist country. He went out and did the Yellow Shark. He created his sort of last masterpiece, which is called Civilization Phase 3. And then in December 1993, he passed away, which is now over 30 years ago. We're still talking about him now. People are still listening to his music. This is a giant within popular music. And I've spent 20 minutes just trying to go through who he is, because what are the elements that make Zappa what he is? Well, there's the studio experimentation. There's the modern classical stuff that he does. There's the comedy stuff that he does. There's Zappa, the guitar hero, and nobody plays guitar solos like Frank Zappa. I think with those elements, we start to encapsulate everything that is there with Zappa. His use of the synclavier with a band is very limited. In fact, I can't think of any. I think some of the live stuff does that. So it would be very hard to find a track that represents the synclavier stuff. So I'm going to kick that one out. But in terms of the sort of modern classical virtuoso approach, the fact that probably the favourite band would be the George Duke Band, the incredible lyrics, the comedy, all of that is directing me towards the George Duke Band. Now, in 1975, he released an album called One Size Fits All. Now, what's interesting with Frank Zappa is that he had a thing called the conceptual continuity. So he said it was a little bit like the way a painter might use a certain colour a lot. You know, like Van Gogh might use yellow a lot in his work, or Rembrandt uses a lot of brown, you know. So he would use certain things and certain phrases, certain lyrics, certain sounds, certain chord progressions. All these things would crop up over and over again. And this would create across his whole catalogue, it would start to tie tracks together. And then if you spotted something in one song and then spotted it in another song, you would then start to realise that the lyrical content was sort of similar, and that Zappa was dealing with similar concepts over and over again. A lot of these were offensive, and so I don't want the obvious ones I want to pick up on. I can't. What could we have? So, a vacuum cleaner, a gas mask. These are things that crop up over and over again. If you look at the album artwork, you will hear a vacuum. You will see a picture of a vacuum cleaner. The vacuum cleaner then crops up, I think, on the back of One Size Fits All, where there's a star map which sort of encapsulates Zappa's, you know, view of the universe. I think it is also on the Joe's Garage artwork as well, and he will then have references to people like L. Ron Hoover when he's taken the mickey out of Scientology. So you start to see these things cropping up, and then you start to think, wonder what this vacuum represents. What does it represent in Zappa's music? I mean, there's a vacuum in 200 Motels, and what does a vacuum do? Well, it goes around sucking stuff up, doesn't it? You know, and what? So it's sort of eating. It's eating the thing around him. It devours. It could be a symbol of capitalism. I don't know, or is it a symbol of modernity and how we want to have everything absolutely spick and span clean? These are some of the elements that you start to get with Zappa, and it's quite interesting when you start to explore these ideas. Once you step back and see this conceptual continuity, you then start to feel, and this was Zappa's intention, that his whole oeuvre was one massive piece of art. Now, I think this is just the case. It is just a fact that this is the case. If you're an artist, you work, and then when you eventually pop your clogs, what's left behind is your life's work, and through that is a story that's told which has certain elements that go through. And I think that's fascinating. Here on this channel, I recently did my 1000th video. We now have 1,000 videos, and there's something I find very pleasurable knowing that I've made 1,000 videos and they are all dealing with certain ideas and they all cross over and refer to each other, and nobody will ever really be able to get an idea of the totality that's contained on all these videos, least of all me, because I'm now at the point where I will think, oh, let's do a video on so-and-so, and then I'll go online, and this has happened loads, and I go, I've got the sun doing something funny here. Let's see if I can move over to there. Whoops. Yes, so I'll go, oh, I'm going to do a video on so-and-so, and it's very specific, this video is, and I'll go onto YouTube, say, let's see if anybody else has done it. Well, they have, me, and mine comes up, and go, oh, God, I've forgotten about that. And so I enjoy that. I enjoy the idea that you've got complete control when you're an artist, to create complete control, to have freedom of expression, to say what you want, to not have to think and worry about what you say, and to really be able to control things to get them how you want, but also to access the unconscious areas and chance and bring in things that are not part of what your vision is. All this I got from Frank Zappa and this approach, and I would really love to have that aspect embodied on this track. So if I was playing this track to somebody and I said, right, have a listen to this, once they got to the end of it, because they're going to be bemused by Frank Zappa, and they should be. There's certain tracks we could go to that are prettier or nicer. So let's have a look at what would be a brilliant example of all the bits he has individually before we get to the track that I think that represents him completely. And I don't think there is one, but I'm going to try and come up with one to get as close as we can. So, studio experimentation. I think there's things on, if you want to hear him doing it in a sort of revolutionary way in the 1960s, it's possibly off the first album, The Chrome Megaphone of Destiny, which is the big epic on side 2, which does all sorts of things. And it's so archaic. A lot of it is just the musicians in the studio like improvising dialogue. But I think that will be a good place to start. If you really wanted to hear how advanced he got, then it would probably be Enlight off Civilization Phase 3. That's the real example of his using of technology to create new sounds. In terms of the comedy, if I wanted to try and get across the sort of comedy, I might play someone Let Me Take You to the Beach, which is sort of a 60s pastiche. It's short, it's funny, and it's more like a conventional comedy parody song, you know, of sort of 60s teen music, and I love that very much. It's great. If I wanted to represent the guitar solos, I don't know, maybe Saint Etienne off Jazz from Hell, which is, I think, one of his prettiest guitar solos. Zappa could be very pretty, very full of space. Watermelon Easter Hay off Joe's Garage would be another one. So there's certain tracks we can look at and look at these individual aspects. In terms of the orchestral, it would undoubtedly be G-Spot Tornado off the Yellow Shark, which is short and to the point. It's exciting, and it's the closest to like a rock track of the orchestral stuff. Naval Aviation in Art would be a nice choice, because it's a rare moment where Zappa actually composed something very beautiful and heart-wrenching, which he can do from time to time. But what track's going to represent all these things? Well, the first one that came to my mind was off the album Studio Tan. It's a side-long track called Gregory Peccary. It's about 20 minutes long. It's almost like a mini rock opera, and it tells the story of a little pig, a peccary, in fact, who works in an office. And he's tired with his office sort of routine. He's got all these secretaries working for him, and they all giggle when he walks in. And his job is to think up things, you know, because it's like an advertising firm. And one day he's thinking there, and he comes up with the idea of time. And once he puts it out there, it changes the world completely. And people start to realize how old they are, and certain people revolt. And he has packs of people trying to find him. So he has to get in his little car and drive up into the mountains. And when he gets onto the mountains, he doesn't realize it, but he's actually gone onto the mountain, which is Billy the Mountain. And Billy the Mountain is a character that is from the song Billy the Mountain, which is, I think, from Live at the Fillmore East. When he's on the mountain, he talks to the mountain, and then the philosopher appears, and the philosopher says something about time. The philosopher actually says time is of affliction. And that's that. Within this, you get a brilliant fusion of rock band, orchestral music, electronic effects, storytelling, humour, and I don't think anybody has ever equalled it in terms of pure progginess. I mean, we can go on about Close to the Edge, we can go on about all those tracks, but nothing is anywhere near Gregory Peccary. No other musician could even attempt to pull this off. And what's incredible about Zappa is where most prog bands are basically writing bits and bits of music and then cobbling them together. Because Zappa's a composer, he seems to have this through composition with a start, a beginning and a middle and an end, and it's also balanced, and he doesn't do what you expect. And then within each of these bits, you see references to other pieces of music, you know. So when he walks into the office, the little pig does, and he walks past all the secretaries, that refers to the office scene in Brown Shoes Don't Make It off Absolutely Free. You know, we have references to Billy the Mountain. Even though there's all this incredible modern classical composition in there, he also keeps bringing up, you hear things like Louie Louie, which is the most simplest, cheesiest tune you can get. I'm having to chase the sun here. Sorry about this. How about that? That's a bit better, isn't it? A weird video, because what we've got here is we've had 3 angles. I've had to move around, you know, in a circle as the sun's moving. And that aspect of time and the way time changes something and the exploration of time is really what Gregory Peccary is about. So it's quite a heavy tune as well as being comedic. The only trouble with Gregory Peccary is a hard listen. I absolutely love it, but it is a hard listen. There's certain elements in it that are like Charles Ives, where you almost feel like there's 3 or 4 bands, you know, moving across each other. So I'm not going to have that one. That's my runner-up. Now, as I mentioned, in 1975, he made an album called One Size Fits All. And this album is often designated by many people as being Zappa's greatest album or their favourite album. I've done this a million times, and I don't know whether it actually is. The thing with One Size Fits All, it's every track on there is absolutely brilliant, but that's not rare for Zappa. You know, if you like Zappa and you buy an album, usually every single track is a winner. You're never going to think, oh, why did he do that? He never does anything. He can't do anything cheesy or make a misstep, because it's not possible when you're Zappa to do that, because you are parodying and turning inside out everything that you do. One Size Fits All, however, I don't think really has, say, the quality of tunes that something like Overnight Sensation has, where there's so many classic tracks on there. And yet that album often gets referenced, and things like Evelyn the Modified Dog, San Bernardino, they're all great tracks, but they're a little bit, I have to be honest, a little bit middle of the road for Zappa. And so as time's gone on, I've thought a lot about One Size Fits All. Now, what's brilliant about One Size Fits All, it almost like acts as a cornerstone within Zappa's catalogue. It's a statement of his metaphysical view of the universe. And it almost states the fact that all his stuff out there comes together, and is the cornerstone of this would be this album One Size Fits All. And I think that's why people like it so much. So Zappa's made it in a way where it does sit on its own, whereas all the other albums are often like, oh, you know, it's like One Size Fits All, that occupies its own space. But Overnight Sensation for me seems to refer to apostrophe, and they swap over. It's very hard to explain this because there's so many elements that are passing through, but One Size Fits All does seem to do what the title says. And you're aware that Zappa has done this deliberately. He knows what he's doing it by titling this album. So this is like, you know, if you went in, this would be the album that you would get if you were going to get one album. And on that album, it opens up with a track called Inca Roads, which is actually about the universe. It's one of the rare instances where Zappa deals directly with the metaphysical. And the way he does it is by questioning whether the work of Eric von Daniken is true or not. Now, Eric von Daniken wrote a number of books in the 70s, most famously Chariot of the Gods, where he argued that human beings had a sort of acceleration in their development when aliens came down and passed on knowledge to ancient people. And then if you go around, there's all these bits of proof. It's been debunked since then, as many things in the 70s have, that alluded to these sort of occult and metaphysical sort of mysteries. And Zappa sort of knows this, and it seems to chime with the track Cosmic Debris, which is about some sort of snake oil spiritual person coming in and trying to con you, and Zappa ends up conning that person. And so Zappa at once deals with the universe and deals with the cosmos and deals with the idea of space and time, but also pokes fun at Eric von Daniken. This track, from the outset, just kicks. It's exciting. It's very fast and frenetic, but it's also got these great big spacey things. Never in my history of listening to Frank Zappa was I so blown away instantly by a track as I was when I first put Inca Roads on, and that drum beat comes in and that brilliant riff, and you're on the sort of Moog synthesizers, you can hear the whizzing of UFOs all around, and then George Duke's brilliant vocal comes in, and it's so beautiful, and it's got sort of the elements of jazz fusion and funk, a little bit of Stevie Wonder, all that stuff's in there. And then it starts to move, and it goes through an incredible modern classical section. And that modern classical section is stated as an instrumental, but it also contains this sort of virtuoso singing that is all over the place, that he first did, in my knowledge, on the track Montana, where he got Tina Turner and the Ikettes to sing an almost impossible vocal line. That's a bit's incredible. Then we go into a guitar solo, and this guitar solo was actually recorded live and it's edited. And so you get this idea of studio and live mixed together with overdubs and all that type of stuff. It's structurally absolutely perfect. The way the guitar solo drops in, it feels like it needs to be there. And as it comes out, you get one of Zappa's great melodies. And then you get an incredible multi-layering of instruments, which Zappa's so great at, where he has the toms and the flute running together. So this track, I think, would be the best seller to someone who's never heard Zappa before, or someone who's listened to a few things and decided they didn't like them, to really explain what Zappa is all about. So my offering on this video, on the first of this series of this is the one track, and for me, if I was washed up on a desert island and I could only pick one Zappa track, it would be Inca Roads. So if you like this video, what's happened here and what I've been doing, put a like on it. You could subscribe. You could also follow me over on Patreon. You can become a free member or paid up member. I also have a PayPal tip jar down below. So if you'd like to drop something in there, thank you very much. And I quite like this leaning on the side of the chair. I might do this again. It looks quite nice over here, doesn't it? With the sun. And every time I spit, you see all everywhere, isn't it? I quite find that quite pretty in a way. It's like snow. It's very nice. I like that. I like aesthetic things like that. That's what I am. That's what I like. I hope you like it too. And not just thinking, why is Andy spitting at the end of this video? Well, I am. That's the way it is. Thank you very much. See you on the next video.